Wordle, lexicon game, GeoGuessr, geography game, Scrandle, Scran type game? What the hell do you even call these games? Browser games? Maybe logic-based puzzlers? Logic games? Just puzzlers? Deduction games? I don't know. If there's a word their communities like to assign to categorize these games, I'm just not aware of them, so feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. But even so, I guess there's one thing I'm most certain of, which ties all of these things together. They're each digital and interactive, you can provide input by pointing, clicking, or typing, and they each have a specific rule set, have win or lose conditions, or some kind of scoring system. So from a formal, non-colloquial standpoint, these are for all intents and purposes, video games. You might say, yes Blango, you dumbass, these are obviously video games. But the reason why I'm even having trouble categorizing these games in the first place is because they're very unique and unlike most other games I'm familiar with. You'd think that in an industry raking in the cash with battle royales, Kumar gacha games, and other various forms of slop, these types of games would only be played by a small number of people that you can count with your fingers. But in reality, they're not really that niche, which I find kinda surprising. They're actually moderately popular among different ages and demographics. What also helps with exposure is that your favorite streamers tend to like these sorts of games. Even some people I know who will not touch most video games with a 10-foot pole play some form of these video games religiously on their phones. One of the reasons for these games' popularity is because they're super accessible, even more accessible than the most AAA hand-holdy movie games. With the exception of GeoGuessr, they're also just straight up free, with none of the same strings attached you'll find in most other quote-unquote free-to-play titles. They also tend to test aspects of your knowledge that aren't often tested in conventional video games. Scrandle, for example, sounds like a meme, and I mean it kind of is just a fucking meme, but if we take it seriously for a second, the game shows you two pictures of decent-looking stadium food or obscene affronts to God, and asks you to choose which one is generally preferred by stadium goers. You could just go off your base instincts and choose which one looks more edible than the other, which I think is a viable general strategy most of the time, but this will only get you so far. If you really want to squeeze the most juice out of a choice to maximize your chances of getting a correct answer, there are more factors than just how yummy or vile the food looks to think about. The game also mentions things you might want to take into account, like prices, which can play a role in what the correct answer is. Sometimes food that looks like disgusting garbage will beat out okay-looking food simply because it's cheaper. But sadly, even if you try to make a deduction based on all of these factors, you're not guaranteed to get it right, because the correct answer is ultimately subjective, and chosen just because more or less people happen to like a certain type of food. Once you realize that the game doesn't have super clear and objective criteria for right or wrong answers, there's nothing stopping you from thinking the game is just a meme. But even if it is just a meme, it's still a fun game to mess around with and make fun of horrible, putrid-looking meals or delicious delicacies coming out of different countries, especially if you're just shooting the shit with friends. Wordle, on the other hand, is a more tightly designed game because it's built around a very clear internal logic. There's a definite answer, a finite word list, and a consistent set of rules that don't shift depending on public opinion. In other words, if your answer is wrong, it's your fault. If you're really generous and add all forms of words including obsolete ones, acronyms, slang, regional terms, variants, and inflections, there are upwards of 600,000 words in the English language. Wordle asks you to find a single 5-letter word out of a possible 8,000 to 10,000. It even goes further out of its way to shave it down by making their standard number of solutions and easier to deal with 2,300, or something like that. A tiny slice of the linguistic iceberg, but one that still manages to trip people up daily, including me. Wordle is interesting to me because even if you're not really an expert in English, you'll still have a decent chance at succeeding thanks to the way it rewards pattern recognition and your Herlock-Sholmes deduction abilities more so than it does your knowledge of English vocabulary. The best strategy, or at least the strategy that works the best for me, is using a nice 5-letter word that scratches off a bunch of vowels and a couple consonants, like audio or something. The game then narrows down your options for the correct letters to use by turning them gray, orange, or green. The remaining letters you haven't used become some sort of a logical puzzle, as you'll have to use your powers of elimination and probability to get the right answer. And out of the three, GeoGuessr has to be my favorite, because not only does it test your skill of deduction, it also tests in equal parts your knowledge of geographical information and environmental awareness. And also, holy shit, does this game have a crazy fucking high skill ceiling. Morons like me at the very bottom of the ladder will probably just look at the language of any nearby street signs or advertisements to narrow down their answers, but some top CSI motherfuckers take into account the tiniest of things like soil color, tree types, shapes of license plates, or even the materials for how power poles are constructed to really zero in on their shit with pinpoint accuracy. These games are plenty of innocent fun. They're unique, novel, and I'd even go so far as to say endearing. Sorry to be this guy though, but these games aren't unique to the medium of video games. They can be each done physically or on a tabletop with a pen and paper, or in some other physical form. Wordle is obvious. With a few minor changes to the format, you can easily play this game on a piece of paper. There are even some YouTubers who upload their gameplay in a completely physical format. For Scrandle, you and your mates can head out to the ground to take the piss out of your local football club. And then ask them to choose which one of two pieces of shit, which one they think is more popular among stadium goers. And for GeoGuessr, you can either print out a Google Earth picture and have the player point to a spot on a physical globe, or blindfold them and fly them out to the middle of the Sahara or something and ask them to do the same thing. I can't really be critical of the mode of interaction in these games though. No one shits on games like Magic the Gathering Arena or any of the Baldur's Gate games simply because they're video game adaptations of tabletop rule sets. One of my most played games ever, Slay the Spire, can easily be played in a physical format. It even has its own tabletop version that anyone can buy and enjoy. And if you really want to drive a stake through my heart, you can even turn my own logic against me, as none of my videos play to the unique strengths of the video or filmic medium. My videos are just words, which can be much more efficiently consumed by reading it on a piece of paper or hearing it on the radio. I can also break into your house, put on some lazy Hawaiian music, play video games in front of you, talk shit about the games industry while I do it, and you'll still largely get the same experience as you would watching my videos. I know how thin the ice I'm walking on is. Please believe me when I say that only a snobby, pedantic asshole dickface would sit here and tell you that games like Scrandle, Wordle, and GeoGuessr aren't real video games. So I'll try and skirt around that and say that while these Sherlock Holmes Art of Deduction games are all definitely video games, they're not what I would point to if someone asked me what exactly is the perfect example of a video game. I think there is real merit to experiences which can only be video games. Or at least there's something unique about experiences that require computation to exist. Of course, each of the games I mentioned literally require computation to exist. Otherwise, for lack of better words, they just wouldn't exist. We'd just be staring at a black screen looking inward into our reflections.
Fucking bad bitch at this game, son. Oh god damn.
Real-time action games in particular are the greatest examples of experiences which require computation to exist that I can think of. These games simply can't survive outside of code. If you try to simulate them physically, the experience would just collapse. Although, technically, every single action game in existence can be turned into a physical adaptation. Even seemingly untouchable character action games like DMC can be turned into a tabletop form as well. By drawing or printing out each frame of gameplay individually, step through debug style, placing a sheet of paper on the table and then asking for the player's input, and then placing another, newer sheet of paper based off what button the player just pressed. But that would just be unrealistic, and I don't think I need to go too deep into detail for you to imagine that this would be incredibly boring to play. With how slow the gameplay would end up being, there'd obviously be much more opportunity to perform frame-perfect combos and stuff, but part of the appeal of playing an action game like this is perfecting the timing of your combos during an unforgiving, high-speed feedback loop. And honestly, if someone printed out a single page of gameplay every minute or so, while I was only allowed to provide input in between each frame, I'd rather just blow my brains out. I'm not a huge CRPG guy, so I'm not going to pretend like I really know what I'm talking about when it comes to them, but both of Larian's DOS games and BG3 deserve praise for its adherence to allowing the player a similar amount of freedom you can get from an actual in-person D&D session. From an outsider's perspective, the isometric point-and-click gameplay in these games seems rather limiting, but that is super duper far from the case. You're granted an almost unfathomable amount of freedom in these games, and you can break them in such absurd ways. And even if you do that, break the game by blowing up the final boss with a shit ton of fireworks, it still feels like you've earned your victory, because you can easily picture yourself doing the same thing by outsmarting a DM in real life. However, even with all the freedom you're given in these games, they don't really do anything you couldn't already do in a traditional pen and paper session. Almost the entire structure of these CRPGs are lifted wholesale from tabletop RPGs, with some obvious differences you'd have to include to make a digital version of D&D playable. Even in the case of the original Sin games that aren't one-to-one adaptations of D&D rule sets, you can still feel that they're following the same DNA that's been around since the 70s. Real-time with pause seems like the next step in the evolution towards pure action, but even then it's still kinda just the same thing. You're still selecting from menus, still operating within a quasi-turn-based system, and still watching your dice rolls resolve things you declared you were gonna do, not what you really did. And then there are rare titles like Undertale or Super Mario RPG or
Oh, oui, madame. Madame, I would like to stick my baguette in your vagin.
which have standard turn-based systems, but mix in action systems like pressing a button at a specific time, or even just a straight-up shmup sequence. But even despite all that jazz, those real-time flourishes are really just action sprinkles on the same tabletop cupcake. In these cases, the computer just saves you from having to do the dice rolls yourself. Believe me, some of these games are really, really good, and even goated. Maybe I'm just a drooling idiot, but it's hard for me to see how many of these turn-based games are uniquely digital experiences. They're not completely built around the strengths of the medium. They're ultimately just recreating something analog, but much more efficiently. This is why I think games where you control your character in real time are perfect examples of what can only be done in video games. You can't double jump dozens of feet into the air and simultaneously shoot, punch, slash, or stab at things in real life. I mean, you can, but you'd probably go to jail or just die. Computers allow us to do these sometimes batshit insane things in a safe, gamified setting. Computers allow us to bend the rules of realities both with and without consequences. And more importantly, computers paved the way towards a new form of entertainment which has taken the world by storm. It's all thanks to computers, the madmen who invented them, the madmen who continuously innovate in computer technology, and the madmen who make video games. I guess what I'm trying to avoid saying is that video games are more than tabletop games. But the use of the word more implies that physical games are a lesser medium. Even if I believed that to be true, that wouldn't make it objectively true, because what makes a medium better than another medium is completely subjective anyway. I cannot argue that the act of digitizing what would otherwise be manual labor is a waste of time. Word processors, video and photo editing software are not wastes of time. And likewise, adaptations of tabletop rule sets are not wastes of time either. But at the same time, neither can I argue that they're fully capitalizing on the possibilities of the digital medium. At most, they're just streamlined translations which remove the logistical friction of tabletop play. This is what separates real-time action games from traditional board games, card games, or other physical types of games. It's because you can manually perform certain actions like drawing cards, rolling dice, or tracking turns with a pen and paper in real life, but you can't replicate the feel of real-time interaction, or the way these actions you declare in these games feel in motion, or the way a game's speed, responsiveness, or sheer audiovisual overload tickles your senses as you interact with the game's mechanics in real time. That shit simply cannot exist outside a screen and without your input through a gamepad, fight stick, or keybum. When I visualize maneuvering a character in Smash Bros in my head, I can feel my brain press buttons on a GameCube controller in specific, deliberate ways even though I didn't tell it to. And I can feel my character's momentum accelerating and then decelerating. You have my permission to give me a swirly based off that cringy fucking statement alone, but what's kinda telling is that I can't really say the same for Slay the Spire, even though I put more than 1,000 goddamn hours into that game. Speaking of which, playtime check. Of course, I know that any Smash game and Slay the Spire are two games in completely different worlds. Smash is a fighting and platforming adjacent game, and Slay the Spire is a roguelike deck builder. One requires you to outspace and outmaneuver your opponents, and the other requires you to make the best out of RNG. They're two totally different genres, like apples and hand grenades, but that's kind of the point. Slay the Spire is deliberation and bookkeeping, and whose experience can be ported to cards, counters, and a notepad if you got the patience. Super Smash Bros, or any fighting game for that matter, is timing windows measured in frames. It only makes sense when a computer is sampling your inputs and checking for hit and hurt box collisions every second. I could just be mistaking this for muscle memory, but I think there's a difference between remembering a rhythm and feeling a rhythm. With Smash, I don't just recall inputs, I can actually feel the weight of my character short hopping and fast falling into a tilt. It almost like, and go ahead and tell me to touch grass, but it almost lives in my fingers and brainstem like some kind of gamer phantom limb. What's kind of weird to me is that everything running on a computer is essentially just zeros and ones. And to a filthy subhuman layman like me, those zeros and ones feel like they should naturally lend themselves to turn-based systems. One thing happens, then another thing happens. Input, response, action, resolution. It's clean and orderly and perfectly mirrors the idea of turns in a turn-based game. But computers are so fucking fast and powerful nowadays that those zeros and ones I mentioned can flip on and off millions of times per second. Here's something crazy I learned about CPUs just now. 1 gigahertz equals 1 billion cycles per second. Cycles meaning things like adding two numbers together, moving data, or doing some other robot shit. My CPU's base clock is at 4.2 gigahertz. That means every second it can run 4.2 billion fucking operations. To put that into perspective, if you held a gun to 200 guys in an office building, gave them each a calculator and told them to do one calculation per second 24/7 without stopping to piss, shit, or sleep for 240 days in a row, those poor bastards still wouldn't catch up to what my CPU could do in a single second. Isn't that kinda terrifying? Computers handle all the timing, calculations, visuals, among other things. The magic of real-time action games only exists because of how effortlessly computers handle work that would be unrealistic or impossible for even the most talented, hard-working dungeon master, or even a group of them. But even then, even with all the detracting I did earlier, basically saying that turn-based games aren't real video games, there's still something unique about them existing within a digital space. I'm too dumb to really articulate what that something is, but my guess is that it has something to do with the experience. There's a real perceptible experience you can get just going to Google, typing in Wordle, going on the New York Times website, inputting keystrokes and watching the letters turn green or orange. There's a real perceptible experience you can get when logging into GeoGuessr, hopping into a duels match, queuing against someone in the opposite side of the world, and lose like a stupid dumbass to someone in California or something. And then there's a real perceptible and fucking fantastic experience you get from listening to professional voice actors say dialogue in response to your answers, or seeing your character cast Fireball with your own two eyes, or especially when you're on the throes of losing your run in honor mode, but suddenly get a crit and hear Mr. Slav's beautiful soundtrack swell as the tides of battle turn in your favor. So please don't let my pseudo-intellectual dumbass stop you from enjoying any of these types of turn-based games. Some of these games are the best games of all time. Divinity Original Sin certainly is on my top 20 GOATs list. And as much as I like to pretend that I'm smart by using a bunch of big fancy words, in reality each of my videos are close to disconnected babbling, and even when my words aren't incoherent, I only just barely touch on the key points I try to hit. There are probably people with triple my IQ that find these types of games way more appealing than the games I'm into. For better or for worse, computers are almost everywhere nowadays, certainly wherever you'd find a bunch of humans. In the office, in the living room, on the road, on your wrist, in your pocket, even in those strange smart toilets you'll find in Japan or other touristy areas. Software developers, engineers, and of course computers are the silent co-authors and tools of a huge number of experiences we have nowadays. Programmers program, then computers run the numbers, move the pieces, and light the pixels. They handle the parts we don't see so we can focus on the fun stuff. And the craziest part to me is that we barely even think about it. At least I don't. I just assume that my PC will do what I ask it to. Open up browsers, send messages, watch videos, and play games. To quote our Lord and Savior himself, all of it just works. I'm by no means a computer nerd. The most I can do is slap together a bunch of PC parts correctly. I also have close to zero programming knowledge, and the little I do have is from doing barely functional baby shit in Scratch, and a couple of hours of cobbling together horribly unoptimized code in GDScript. For the life of me, I could never really go too deep into any of this wizard stuff, mostly because I'm too dumb for it. I think I kind of fall in a nice, comfy mid-wit zone when it comes to all things computers. It's precisely because I find this black magic so hard and confusing to do, which springboards my appreciation of them, including video games, and especially how far they've come over the years. I have fucking zero idea how engineers make computers go bloop, and millions of mathematical or logistical operations happen per second. Ignorance is bliss, as they say. I know that basically all of my videos are kinda just me shit-talking the modern video games industry and all the people involved in it. So I thought it'd be nice to mix things up a little and have a somewhat positive video for a change. I know how fucking sad this is gonna sound, but a surprising number of the experiences I value are thanks to computers. Or at least partially thanks to computers. And I've never really sat down to appreciate or at least acknowledge how much I depend on them for entertainment a lot of the time. I've never even heard of it before I searched it up just now, but this past February 15th, 2025 was apparently the world's first Computer Appreciation Day. And there's also Programmers Day, to be celebrated on the 256th day of each year. And I think it's kinda cool that some people somewhere decided to dedicate a couple days out of the year to appreciating computers and the madmen behind the keyboards. This isn't to sound like some cultist scripture of computers, programmers, and video games. Computers will most likely play, at the very least, a significant role in the downfall of the human race, which is very, very possible and very, very much closer than we think. If you don't know what the Doomsday Clock is, it's basically a symbolic representation made by a bunch of scientists of how close humanity is to self-extinction. As of the making of this video, we're currently at around 89 seconds to midnight, midnight being us blowing ourselves up or something. We're currently closer than we've ever been to midnight, closer than the Cold War, closer than Chernobyl, and closer than that one time people thought Hawaii was under missile attack by the supreme leader in North Korea. When that missile scare thing happened, I was working as a security guard at a rich person hotel in Waikiki. The alert was only airing for like 5 minutes or something, with a false alarm coming after like another 40 minutes. But even then, that short amount of time in that kind of situation felt a little like an eternity. The two most vivid things I can remember was some lady pushing a stroller past me with her baby in it, repeatedly saying, "We're gonna be okay, we're gonna be okay." And another poor receptionist lady running up to me, frantically asking where she and her coworkers should go. In my head, I was like, bitch, fuck if I know, I'm just a stupid kid, go home to your family. But in reality, I was just as scared and confused as she was. I don't even remember what exactly came out of my mouth, I just remembered that I stuttered out a barely intelligible answer. Later on, when the news was reporting on this stuff, they showed a quick clip of the workspace belonging to the guy that pressed the missile alert. They call it a state warning point, but it really just looks like a desktop with a higher number of monitors on it than average. Not too different from what my setup looks like at home. I don't know the true details of what happened with this whole crisis. Some people say that the guy accidentally pressed the wrong buttons a couple times. Some people say that the guy's higher-ups specifically told him to press the button after seeing red blips on their radars. And some people say that it was just a test to see how the public reacts. I don't know, all of these theories could be bullshit. The only person that will ever truly know what happened is the guy that sat in that chair. But the point is, the piece of technology revolving around this whole shebang, other than the ballistic missiles of course, is just a computer. Just a computer doing what it was told. Computers don't care if they're running Baldur's Gate 3 or launching a false nuclear alert. They don't care if they're rendering anime titties or calculating ballistic trajectories. They can't care, they're just following instructions. I think that's a little of what makes them both amazing and kinda scary at the same time. The same systems that light up my screen with unholy abominations, stupid memes, porn, and video games are also wired into stock markets, traffic systems, missile silos, and emergency broadcasts. I suppose computers are a little like language. Language can be used in soothing, beautiful ways to describe your care and appreciation for a loved one, but it can also be used to viciously attack, insult, or incite violence against others. I also rarely hear of anyone around me appreciating language. Similar to Computer Appreciation Day, there are also days dedicated to the celebration of a bunch of languages, but I've never even known these to be a thing. There are so many powerful, amazing things that I take for granted every day, things like medicine or plumbing, and tons of other things that I can't even think of because I've lived my whole life in a world where they just exist. They've always been there, invisible, until they stop working. And at the top of my list of those things I take for granted are computers. Computers are, if not the backbone, then at least like the L4 of our modern lives. And like every other tool or invention in existence, they can be used for both good and bad. They make our lives super convenient and a little bit more filled with dopamine and entertainment, but in the wrong hands or with the wrong instructions, they also have the potential to help facilitate catastrophic, world-ending mistakes. Whether they're powering my favorite games or accidentally facilitating a near apocalypse, they deserve at least a passing nod of recognition. If nothing else, I just wanted to give a little acknowledgement to the people and the machines that make all my favorite games possible, and to remind myself not to take life or any of the fun experiences that come with it, digital or otherwise, for granted.